We have moved from a very rigid understanding of things into a far less rigid understanding of things. And of course, because it's harder to look at irregularity, in other words, where it looks like something does not have a particular shape, which is part of the spiritual world, we can't put it in a box. And because we can't put it in a box, we can't really study it. And therefore, it remains this, thing that we can't really get a handle on. Now, I would never think to reduce the Godhead into something that I can understand. But I feel that the extent to which we are created in His image is part of what kings are meant to search out, right? It's part of the revealed in creation. And I believe that we need to study. And the person who started to give us a practical way to do that, at least to some extent, is Benoit Mandelbrot, who was a computer wizard or genius or some other religiously acceptable term, who was able to start computing irregularity by finding an underlying pattern. And the engineers are familiar with fractals. He called it fractals, but it's essentially self-replicating patterns. And that's the fairly well-known Mandelbrot fractal. Now, what is a fractal? A fractal is a relatively simple pattern that, when it expands, produces incredible creativity, diversity, and complexity. In a sense, a fractal is the ultimate compromise between intrinsic faithfulness and tremendous creativity. Example of that would be the genetic code. We've got 4 nuclear bases that interact in very specific ways that are able to express all forms of biological life. That's a fractal. It is an intrinsic, fairly simple pattern that produces enormous complexity. And that gives us a way of looking beyond squares, spheres, triangles, and basic patterns. Now, if this seems very abstract, let me tell you that it's already part of your world. Your cell phone no longer has a visible antenna. Do you know why? Because inside, it's got a chip that looks like that, which is a fractal antenna, which is a carefully, geometrically designed arrangement of copper wiring that is able to detect multiple frequencies because it can cross over them in different patterns because it's got that particular fractal design. So that's an example of fractals. In the medical field, we're starting to look at what is called heart rate variability. In other words, we're not only looking beep, 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 but we're looking at how the beep, beep, beeps relate to one another. And we now know that heart rate variability is a reflection of sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. In other words, the way your fight and flight and rest and digest system have a tug of war has a signature that you can detect when you look at the pattern of how heart rate changes. So I can look at whether you're stressed or not based on heart rate variability.
That's TCM.
Well, we say, we put it, okay, it's in this box. And because it's TCM, anything that's bad about TCM, we will now associate with that, you see. And therein lies the fallacy. I can tell you, in Western medicine, there are an incredible amount of occultic and ungodly practices. But do we dismiss Western medicine? Well, I don't know whether you do it here, much of it should be. But it's embraced by pretty much everybody on the other side of the pond. So we need to differentiate, because otherwise we're going to be prejudgmental. Now, heart rate variability in terms of how it's applied, in other words, using meditation, rosary beads, circular breathing, or other methods for which this provides the biological marker, gets at a different level. In other words, if you use a pregnancy test in an abortion clinic, it's different than if you use it in a maternity clinic. Okay? But the test is still the test. And the measurable component is not the problem. It's what we do with the measurement. It's how we interpret the measurement. But we don't dismiss the measurement. Okay. So what I'm telling you is that heart rate variability as a physiological, mathematical assessment is grounded on very solid mathematical reproducible principles. Nobody's guessing. You can actually measure it. It's not this black box and who knows what's going in there. Okay? It's part of established science, the measurement. Okay. Oh, and by the way, Pixar, Disney animation, all these beautiful landscapes of Shrek and so on, those are all generated by fractal algorithms. And that's why they look so natural, because our natural world is fractal. Okay, it's beautiful. Look at the sky. Sometimes it looks like ribs. Sometimes it looks like vertebrae. Okay, there's a beautiful way in which nature expresses itself in fractals. And there's an example of a sort of mackerel sky. Very, very beautiful patterns. Professor Emoto in Japan took pictures of water freezing at -4 degrees. And depending on what was spoken, there was a material interaction. And you got ugly crystals, beautiful crystals, well-shaped crystals, etc., etc. So, is that occultic? Isn't that occultic? That's irrelevant in terms of the observation. The observation says there's an interaction with water and it shapes differently based on something being put on it. So don't dismiss the whole thing and ignore the observation. Because we tend to do that, you know. Because someone has left a nice waft of flatus, we don't want to be in the building. Okay, if you know what I mean, right? I don't know if there's another word to say flatus politely, but you know what I mean. So in other words, the one offensive item makes us discard the whole issue. And I think it leaves us very anemic and prejudicial. What I'm trying to convey is a need for us to think at a different level. We need to look at these things with different eyes, and with especially an eye for patterns, because patterns give us a way to understand beyond, you know, the simple mechanical. And I'm going to give you a way to understand, or at least to think about, the level of the body, the level of the soul, and the level of the spirit. We're going to break down into the familiar threes just now, spirit, soul, and body. But I want to give you a slightly different set of themes, because we often get confusion and scientific dishonesty when we try and work at different levels. And I'll explain it using scripture in a moment. So let's start with let's call it our physical world. In our physical world, we recognize that there's matter and energy. Of course, quantum physics is throwing those definitions a little, but I think we do recognize that there are things that have substance, and there are things that perform work, which is what we would refer to as energy. And what brings order is information, right? We've got the DNA that is being used to transmit the information that becomes substance and is sustained by energy. So, at this level, we're talking about mechanism. So in the physical world, biological world, area of the body, we have mechanisms. And the mechanisms are made up of components which we can conveniently divide into those that are ordering, those that are substantive, and those that are supportive or energy. Now, what do we find on the level of the soul? How do we organize our soul and our soul life? Well, our soul life actually consists of our exchange of information amongst one another, which we call relationship. Okay? There are obviously sources of energy, which we would call resources in the broader sense of the term. And then the substance of our life is made up of our habits. You could call it routines, if you like, which is a somewhat less sort of religious term, or rituals. In other words, we have our little ways of doing things. So how do I produce meaning? Well, I invite you to go with me to have a cup of coffee. We have a relationship, we have a resource, and there's the ritual. And our life at the soul level is made out of these composites. And when you'll see that God refers to the soul in the Bible, it's often in what you delight in. What is the resource, relationship, and ritual or habit that will provide you with meaning? Okay, the soul craves meaning. It's interpretation. What's going on? I need to understand. Those are soul-based functions, needs, and dimensions.
Value also.
Value.
Yes.
Well, meaning or value, yes. So meaning, in other words, what determines that your life is worthwhile. But there is a higher level. And the higher level, and the names, obviously, it's impossible to choose a name that doesn't have baggage. But what I mean by mysticism is the pursuit of spiritual information, spiritual knowledge, spiritual relationship. Spiritual exchange is at the level of the mystical. Then we have spiritual experience. It sometimes may manifest as goosebumps or something else, but there is a capacity for spiritual experience. And then, of course, there is the behavioral constructs, in other words, what we do with what we've learned and what we feel, and that then becomes the framework for religion. That's how we essentially construct the substance of this level of spiritual existence. And that determines purpose. Whenever you look at spiritual issues, it's always a purpose-related thing. It's something that drives. It prescribes. It predetermines. Whereas meaning interprets and mechanism performs. Now, let me use an example. In Isaiah, I think it's 40:22, there's God stretches out the heavens like a tent. Okay? Now, a materialist will say, well, what an idiot. I mean, they're balls of gas suspended in the middle of a vacuum. You know, what's this tent business? But we need to understand it at three levels. At the mechanism level, the spread out represents the expansion of the universe, right? So there's a mechanism that actually is accurate. It is spread out. What is the meaning of a tent? Now you need to think like a nomadic Middle Eastern person. What were tents made of? Dark goat's hair skin. What was in the skin? Holes. What would it look like if you were inside the tent, away from the scorching sun, looking up? You would see dark skin with light. So the heavens are a symbol, if you want to call it that, of a tent. It's that protection. In other words, at the meaning level, the heavens represent the home. You are in God's home because it is similar to a tent. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of doing that? To demonstrate His magnitude, to demonstrate His protection. Okay? So there are different levels. But if you only look at it at the mechanism level, you'll say, well, this is nonsense. Do you understand what I'm trying to communicate? We need to understand there is physical, psychological, and spiritual levels of understanding. Okay. So can you see the principle? And I know I'm belaboring it, but if we don't transform how we think, we're going to be stuck in this dual world in which we can't appreciate the one because our minds are going to tell us that's nonsense. And we don't appreciate the symbolism. And just now when I talk about the placebo, I'm going to refer back to this. Okay. So we've got these interrelated structures, if you want to call it that. In our physical world, we have information, matter, and energy that prescribe mechanism. You can measure it, it's predictable, it follows the laws of physics. At the soul level, we've got meaning made up of relationships, rituals, and resources. And at the spiritual level, we've got mysticism, which means spiritual exchange, knowledge, and relationship. Spirituality, which I've chosen to represent the experience of spirituality or the spiritual. And religion, which becomes the construct. And you can see they are related, but they're not exactly the same. The themes are similar, but they work at different levels. I don't want to give the game away yet, so just trust me for now. All right, now what is spirituality? If you look at Dr. Google or Wikipedia, you know, our standard sources of information, it's the ultimate or alleged immaterial reality, inner path, deepest values and meanings, practices, experiences, larger reality, source of inspiration. It's completely useless from a research point of view because it can mean anything to anybody. So from a research point of view, it's hopeless. But from a relationship and a dialogue purpose, it's great. Do you have any spiritual needs? It can mean anything to anybody, right? So it's probably the least offensive term you could possibly use, because it can mean to that person what they want it to mean. And therein lies its greatest value. This is just an interesting understanding. Religion is for people afraid of going to hell. Spirituality is for those who've already been there. And I think much of the antithesis, much of the antagonism that we have against, let's call it religious structures, is people's sense that they are mechanisms for control and threats of punishment in order for people to conform to a particular form of conduct to please someone who really has their own interests at heart. I mean, that is sort of the extension, and unfortunately parenting and culture often reinforces the deep disdain for it. But I think we need to also appreciate that spirituality is something that most people that have been traumatized, even in families, even in the church, would still be able to talk about. And therefore it provides a term of safety. And that's the point I'm trying to make. So maybe I could summarize it this way. Spirituality, if you want to use a definition, is more about the experience of the spiritual. Mysticism is more about the knowledge or the exchange. And religion is more about the constructs or the behaviors, so that we can be more consistent in how we use the terms. Now that's sort of on the spiritual level. On the soul level, we spoke about relationships, resources, and rituals or routines. Well, the way we organize this in our world can be summarized into three categories. Religion influences our behavior. So it is oriented towards what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong. It is a construct for behavior, if you want. Science is the construct for information. In other words, the true, the information. How do we relate to our world? How do we understand our world? That dimension is typically the domain of science. And then finally, art, in all its forms, is the aesthetic, the experiential, the beautiful. Now, some of these are easy to study. I mean, you can count three things and you've got three, and it will always be that way. How do you do a double-blind randomized trial on the sunset? Well, it's beautiful, but, you know, how do you do a randomized double-blind trial? So some of these are readily studyable and others aren't, but they're also true. No one would say a sunset isn't true. You can't measure it with your yardstick for true because that's the scientific method. Do you see where I'm going? Doesn't mean there isn't a sunset. Doesn't mean it's invalid. Doesn't mean your experience of the sunset is irrelevant. It just means it's not in the domain that I can study with the tools that were made for that domain. Right. So science tries to understand what spirituality is about, purpose, is about why. What's behind it? Why? And that's why there are so many clashes. Now, just now I spoke to you about the similarity between faith and science. And let me explain that. Science, as our agreed, statistically derived method, accepts when we are 95% confident that we will have a reproducible result. In other words, if we do this and this, we're 95% sure we'll get that. Then we confirm that as truth. So there is a certain amount of experience and certainty that we now say, well, this is a fact. And we now have faith that if we do the experiment again, we have a 95% chance it's going to happen again. And now we have made faith science. Our experience of the past is now being projected into the future. And that's exactly what faith is. When God explained himself in Scripture, he continued to say, well, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the one who brought you through the Red Sea. I am the one who did that. In Hebrews, the whole of faith is always, well, he did this, 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 therefore he will do that. That's a scientific method. It's not, I don't know what he's going to do, but today he's going to do this for me. Okay? That may or may not be true. But we should differentiate that from what is described as faith. What is faith? What does Hebrews say faith is? The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's scientific language. We just made it an idol. Okay. Now, for those of you that actually want to study the effects of religion or spirituality on health, there is an enormous amount of scientifically valid literature. What the study of faith or spirituality does is it does not look at measuring the supernatural. It doesn't suppose you can put a spirit in a petri dish. Okay? What it does is it looks at the outward features of spirituality and the effects they have on health outcomes. Okay, so it looks at it from what we would call a utilitarian point of view. It looks at what it is and what it does. It doesn't assume what it is. It doesn't prescribe what it is. It just looks what it is and what it does. Right? So it's utilitarian. It looks at it as a commodity. So religion is influenced by culture, various interactions of community and family and so on. But when this has been studied, the three primary transformation elements are as follows. Mental health, because you have a lot of sane people relative to the number of insane people. Okay? So there is a stabilizing effect related to mental health in communities of faith. The second thing is there's social support. There's the ministry of hospitality. There is the reaching out to the poor. There is that stabilizing effect in society. And finally, there is the inhibition of self-destructive behavior. So those three relatively easily measurable outcomes of a community of faith can be studied quite readily. You can then look at how those parameters, which you can measure, have a biological effect, looking at, for instance, stress hormones, the immune system like natural killer cells or lymphocytes or whatever, the autonomic nervous system, heart rate variability, disease detection, or high-risk behaviors, suicide, smoking, alcoholism. You can measure those things. And those you can then relate to specific health outcomes like infection, cancer, heart disease, hypertension, stroke, etc., etc. They call them structured equation models. In other words, you relate this, positive and negatively to that, positive and negatively to that, positive and negatively to that. And therefore you can say this is associated with that. Okay? And to give you just one example, going to a community of faith, going to church, is as powerful in prolonging your life as smoking is to shortening it. And that comparison has been made. So going to church is as likely to keep you alive as smoking a pack a day is likely to kill you. That is the equivalent statistic, looking at nothing else. And by the way, it's not as good as playing bridge with your buddies, because they've actually compared just a social construct from a spiritual construct. By the way, just going to church is not as good as actually having an intrinsic spiritual relationship. They've measured that as well. So they're wonderful instruments that can be used to objectively look at things like forgiveness, various aspects of spiritual expression. There are validated scales. So if you want to do research, there's a lot of support to do it. We're not in a vacuum. Okay. And I think on that note, I'm going to release you to lunch. And when you return, if you return, we're now going to swing to the constructs of health and disease, followed by pathways of disease.